Welcome everybody. Welcome to Sunday Live Writing for Peace. We have a great hour planned for you. I'm just so excited about it. We've I've been starting with a poem from another poet. And in reading some of Michael's work, it of course made me think about Greg Orr's work. And the poem I brought tonight to read by another poet is titled The Pond. The Pond. Snapping turtles in the pond eat bass, sunfish, and frogs. They do us no harm when we swim. But early this spring, 2 Canada geese lingered, then built a nest. What I'd heard of, our neighbor feared, goslings, as they paddled about, grabbed from below by a snapper, pulled down to drown. So he stuck hunks of fat on a huge wire-leadered hooks attached to plastic milk buoys. The first week he caught 3 turtles, and still there are more. Sometimes he finds the bottles dragged ashore, the wire wrapped several times around a pine trunk, and the steel hook wrenched straight as a pin. That was by Gregory Orr, titled The Pond. And it's from The Caged Owl, new and selected 2002 Copper Canyon. So welcome everybody. I am so pleased to welcome Michael here. We met online. We met primarily through Sam Hamill, which has been a lovely connection. And I'm grateful for it in so many different ways. Michael Sims has been active in politics and poetry for over 40 years as a writer, teacher, editor, and community activist. He is the founder of Autumn House Press, a nonprofit publisher of books of poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and the founder of Vox Populi, an online gazette for poetry, politics, and nature. He is also the author of 4 collections of poetry, a college textbook about poetry, and the lead editor of over 100 published books. Sims has won a number of awards and fellowships, including a certificate of recognition in 2011 from the Pennsylvania State Legislature for his contribution to the arts. Sims has an MFA from the University of Iowa and a certificate in plant-based nutrition from Cornell University, which I absolutely love that fact. Sims is a childhood sexual abuse survivor, a person with autism who did not learn to speak until he was 5 years old, and a recovering alcoholic and drug addict with 35 years of sobriety. Congratulations, my friend. He lives with his wife, Eva, a psychologist, in the historic Mount Washington neighborhood overlooking the city of Pittsburgh. Sims' most recent collection of poems, which we'll hear from tonight, that he'll read from, is entitled American Ash. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Juniper. I really appreciate that introduction. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Writing for Peace is a wonderful organization, and I feel honored to be here and to follow such great other writers that you've interviewed as part of the series. I chose the topic trauma and poetry because that's a subject that's been of concern to me the last few years. I'm 66 years old, but it's only in the last few years that I've come out as being on the spectrum, that is having autism, as well as being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I had personal reasons why I needed to come out with those things to the people I cared about, but also I wanted to explore these subjects as part of my poetry. And so the last few years I've been writing from that point of view of being a survivor. And there are a number of people that I admire who've taken on these subjects. Franz Wright, for example, is a poet I admire a great deal. He wrote bravely about his survival of childhood trauma. And of course, Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, many others have also written about trauma in their lives. And even Emily Dickinson, that most reticent of American poets, does have a poem that begins, "The soul has bandaged moments." And later on in the poem, she says, "The horror welcomes her again." That's Emily Dickinson. We don't usually think of her as a confessional poet, but she did have her moments.
Yes.
There was something in her past which she was working through in her poetry. And that's true of many poets. So I'd like to first talk a little bit about the word trauma so that we know what we're talking about. The word trauma probably comes from the Greek traum, which means wound or damage. And traum also in German means dream. So you have that kind of double etymology there of wound dreams or dreams of wounds. And that's very much what trauma is, where we're reliving something terrible that's happened in our past. Perhaps it was a single incident, or perhaps it was a repeated kind of stress which caused us damage. So we are talking about mental damage to someone caused by his or her having gone through something extremely distressing, oftentimes in childhood, and we relive that. So I'd like to share with you two poems, first a short one, and then the second one a longer one, that come at the experience of trauma from a psychological standpoint. But also, in addition to our personal traumas, there's the larger trauma, which we are all living through on a daily basis, of our society and what we do to each other institutionally. And even more than that, what we do to the earth, to the damage that we cause the earth simply by existing, simply by driving our cars and going to the grocery store and flying in airplanes and eating processed foods and throwing away plastic into the garbage. We are traumatizing the earth. So trauma has different levels to it. There's the personal, there's the societal, and there's also the environmental. So I'd like to read you a couple of pieces which try to come at the issue of trauma from multi-levels. The first one's a short poem. All of these poems are from my book, American Ash, just recently published by the wonderful press Ragged Sky out of Princeton. Who will tell them? It turns out you can kill the earth, crack it open like an egg. It turns out you can murder the sea, poison your own children without even thinking about it. Goodbye, passenger pigeon, once so numerous men threw nets over trees and fed you to pigs. Goodbye, cuckoo, who lays eggs in the nest of strangers. Goodbye, elephant bird, who frightened Sinbad. Goodbye, widgeon, curlew, lapwing, crake. Goodbye, mascarene coot. Sorry, we never had a chance to meet. Who knew you could wipe out everything? Who knew you could crack the earth open like an egg? Who knew the endless ocean was so small? Right now, there are children playing on the shore. There are children lying in hospital beds. There are children trusting us. Who will tell them what we've done?
Fabulous poem. So
Thank you.
with your activism and some of the things that were mentioned in the bio, what are some of the things that you are doing personally to make a change? Some of us know about some of them, but I think that
right. Well, I think the most important thing we can do right now is on a very personal level. My wife and I, for example, just today and over the last week or so have been looking at our plastic. We, just like every American, use a lot of plastic and it ends up in the garbage can. Most of it is not recyclable, at least not where we live. And it just goes into the garbage and ends up in a landfill. And as it deteriorates, those particles end up in the groundwater and probably in the river and the sea. So on a personal level, I think that we need to have a reckoning of how we live and what we do. I had to laugh. There was a major environmental writer who took an airplane to Mongolia to write about the environmental damage that was there. And then she flew to Chile and looked at the environmental damage there. She flew all over the world and she was wringing her hands and talking about this what we're doing to the earth. And it never occurred to her that flying around the world was part of the problem. Now, I don't want to pick on her because it's a mistake that I've made and we all make. We think that wringing our hands and having the right attitude is enough, and it's not. We need, as individuals, to look at what we're doing to the environment. Weirdly, one of the biggest improvements to the environment has been the pandemic shutdown over the last year. We just do a lot less. We drive less, we fly less, we go out to eat less, and because of that, the air and the water have not been deteriorating as quickly. So there's the answer. It's just, what can we do? Now, in terms of politics, like I'm sure all of you, I feel a great weight lifted off of me. I've been a Democratic Party activist for a long time, and I feel I can breathe again. The last 4 years have been so oppressive, and I was so obsessed by the news. I had to watch the news. I had to listen to the news all the time. And the other evening, for the first time in years, I didn't listen to the nightly network news, the PBS evening hour. And it felt really good to know that the world wasn't going to end overnight because I didn't watch the news.
Yes.
So there's a lot that needs to be done. Environmental, racial justice, criminal justice. There's just a whole lot that needs to be done. And now we have some opportunities to get some of that stuff done.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I'm excited. So should I move on to another poem, or did you want to talk some more?
I had that first question for you that we both kind of skipped over, and that is a formative book from your youth. Can you tell us about a formative book from your youth? And you can define youth when that starts.
There were so many. I was a big reader when I was a kid. I couldn't speak very well. My tongue got all kind of cluttered up in my mouth. So I didn't have many friends, and I read a great deal, and that was important to me. The first poet who made a major impact on me was James Wright. Reading his collected poems and then going back and reading some of the other things, including translations. The lyricism, the social conscience, the kind of craft that went into the poems is very influential on me. But before that, there were many books that influenced me. When I was in high school, I read a lot of fantasy books, science fiction and fantasy, and I always thought I would be a fantasy writer. And last year in the pandemic, I was sitting around with nothing to do for hours every day, and an idea for a fantasy novel came to me, and I started writing it. In 6 weeks, it was done. And I showed it to a friend of mine who's a publisher. She said, "Great, but that's not the end of the story." So I wrote another one. She said, "Keep going." So we ended up with a trilogy, which she's going to be publishing. That's Kim Davis at Madville Fantasy in Dallas, and we've worked out the terms of the contract, and so now I'm a fantasy novelist. So Ursula Le Guin, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov were very important influences on me when I was a teenager, and I thought I was going to be that kind of writer, but at some point poetry took hold of me and has never really let go. So even though I'm now a fantasy novelist too, I continue writing poems.
Yes. part of your heart.
Yes, part of my heart. I'll share another poem with you if you don't mind.
That would be wonderful.
This has the same theme, but it's a different kind of poem. It's longer. This is about 150 lines. It takes about 12 minutes to read. Now, I have to warn you, I have to give you a trigger warning. There's a description of a rape, and it is factual, it's autobiographical. That happens about halfway through the poem. So if this is going to be a problem for you, you might want to take this opportunity to go make a sandwich and come back in about 13 minutes. I really don't want my poems to contribute to people's suffering, but this is a poem that's like all my poems. It's almost all of my poems. It's autobiographical. It's called Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing. You may remember the comic book hero Swamp Thing. He was a scientist who was in a laboratory disaster, an explosion, and was transformed into a monster who lived in the swamp. And he became the defender of the swamp, the wetlands. I grew up in Texas on the Gulf Coast, outside of Houston, in what was then a swamp. Nowadays, it's just freeways and shopping centers. But in those days, it was wetlands. And I spent many, many hours riding my bicycle down dirt roads through swamplands, through cane fields, sugar cane fields. It was a huge area. And that was a large part of my youth. Swamp Thing. I wanted to tell you how I grew up outside Houston, the edge of the suburbs, wandering the woods and bayous, following the railroad tracks deep into the sugarcane fields. But I kept thinking of Swamp Thing, a monster, an amalgam of mud and water lilies, vines and cattails, a dripping thing in human shape living in the swamp, protecting plants and animals. And I was remembering the deep woods of oak and sycamore where pools of water were alive with frogs and minnows, and how, if you stood long enough, the frogs sang Om like an army of Buddhists. And one sweltering afternoon, I watched two older boys with a net seining a pond and pulling out fish and netting a turtle, which they beat with sticks until a shell cracked and the naked turtle writhed and the sun dried its flesh, a wanton, unspeakable crime. And I went home to read a comic book, Swamp Thing, in which Dr. Antone Arcane and his nightmarish army of unmen sought the evil ones who murdered his wife. And in the middle of the night, my father caught me with a flashlight under the covers and said we had to talk. And he accused me of talking back to my mother. And when his fist hit my belly, I felt it sink deep all the way to my spine. And when he pulled it out, I thought I heard a sucking noise, like a boot pulled from mud, and I knew he could no longer hurt me. The next morning, I rode my bicycle to Wolf Corner, where coyotes and dogs were hung on a wooden rack to discourage coyotes from stealing calves. And the story was that Comanche hung scalps there to scare the whites, but the whites came anyway and stayed, and my Irish Cherokee ancestors ranched there. And later, I lay in the dark and thought of the snapping turtle the boys killed, how it could take off a finger, and an alligator gar, a monster left over from the dinosaurs, could rend flesh if you weren't happy. But it wasn't violent. It was almost tender. To show me it didn't hurt, he did it to himself, slipping the table knife into his anus. I was 8. He was the older boy next door. He was my best friend and all I knew of love. Afterwards, I went into the woods alone and sat on a log beside the bayou, watching the water slow with mud and rotting vegetation, deer coming to the water's edge early in the morning, the possums and foxes, the wild dogs that live in the woods, free from the leash and chain-link fence. I imagined myself a swamp thing, guarding trees and animals. But over the next few years, The trees were toppled and burned in huge bonfires, and Scarlett O'Hara mansions and Roy Rogers haciendas and Frank Lloyd Wright knockoffs rose in obscene excess. The stream channeled through cement pipes to invisibly carry sewage underground. I mourned the trees, the possums, the gars, and the turtles. I lay in the dark, defiantly reading with my flashlight under the covers of Swamp Thing, one of the elementals born when a being dies in flames and merges with the earth. The elementals became protectors of plants and animals throughout history, eventually joining the Parliament of Trees, a group mind of former elementals. Over time, the membership grew with beings such as I Am, a trilobite, Swamp Necker, a dragon, Bog Venus, a medicine woman, Ghost hiding in the rushes, a 3rd century Chinese sorcerer, and of course, me, Swamp Thing, an early 20th century scientist. Until recently, the parliament was stationed in a grove in Brazil, south of the Tefe River, while our minds dwelled in the realm of the green. And lying in the dark with my anus bleeding, throbbing in pain, I imagined myself one of the elementals, able to transcend pain and defend the children. And once united with a parliament of stones, we set out to destroy humankind for their sins against the earth. We had to fight off the fungus-based gray, invaders from another world who preached peace while actually helping humans with their lies. Our allies were the heavenly power called the Word, which passed on all their power to Swamp Thing, me, who refused in the last second, giving humanity another chance, a few good people, mothers and children who survived the massacre at the hands of the Word, and the Parliament of Trees is now eternally burning in the realm of the green.
Fabulous, fabulous poem, Michael. I
Well,
read this poem over and over again, and I would never in my life have associated DC comic characters with Duende and the passion and edge of Duende, of how there is beauty even in the suffering. And the images, and somebody pulled one out, Cynthia Atkins, like a boot pulled from mud. That line, I mean, there are many lines in here. But I was going to start with this, and I'll say it now, then I'll come back to the comments to see if anybody has any questions or follow-ups. But I wanted to acknowledge this at some point, and I was going to do it in the beginning, but we all, I wrote it out, we all are carrying some measure of grief in our bodies.
yes.
I was recently listening to a podcast in the wee hours that talked about addressing our personal suffering. And if we do, that will resonate positively and impact many generations to come when we do.
Yes.
And I thought about this aspect of my own family's growth and walk on the path. And I thought again, as I read your book and I reread this poem, and how and what you're modeling. And yes, these former poets have done that, but in our society, with the derision and the level of grief that you could cause yourself by being so open with many of these subjects, you're not only modeling how one can move forward, and I thought of this quote from Jane Hirschfield, to take the next breath, to open your eyes the next morning when even the unbearable has happened. You're helping to heal generations to come with this work. And thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Juniper. That means a great deal to me. I admire your poetry. As you know, I've told you that many times. Yes, trauma is not something that's unique to poets. It's not a special condition. It is the human condition. We have all suffered repeated injuries, and we carry those wounds with us all the time. And there are ways of dealing with that trauma, of course. The arts, poetry, dance, exercise, taking care of oneself, taking care of others. These are all therapeutic exercises. I do think that it's important to say that poetry is not therapy. I think sometimes because so many poets now are dealing with trauma as part of their aesthetic, it's confused with therapy. Poetry is an attempt to create music out of suffering or music out of joy. It's much more like dance than like writing essays or journalism. Therapy tries to do something different. It tries to help the person transform him or herself, so that the suffering is lessened. It gives us tools to deal with it. And poetry might be part of that. But poetry and therapy are not the same thing. Sometimes on the internet, I see people writing things as poems, which are really not poems. They're expressions of grief, or they are attempts to wrestle with their past. And those are valuable things to do. But if it ain't got that swing, it don't mean a thing. It's not poetry if it doesn't have a musical quality. And I think it's important to keep that distinction in mind and not confuse the two.
I think that's a great point. I want to pull in a question from the chat, and then I have another question that's connected in a way, and it might be a good time for it. So this one is from, oops, it just hopped because there was another comment. This one's from Loran. Hopefully I'm saying your name correctly, Loran. And a question: what are the images you keep returning to? Those swamps, those trees, and where do you now find peace?
In your poetry, Laurent, I find peace. It's one of the, for those of you who haven't read her work, I highly recommend it. Some of the most beautiful poetry being written today. Where do I find peace? I am blessed with some beautiful relationships. My relationship with my wife, she's my second wife, so this is my second try at this, but we've been married for about 35 years. And I dearly love her. I believe she loves me. And without her, it would have been the last year would have been extremely difficult. I would have been completely isolated. And I have friends who've been isolated the last year, and it's been very tough for them. So my relationship, my love for my wife, my children, who are both grown, I'm very proud of and enjoy talking with them. We only talk on the phone or electronically now, but still those relationships are important to me. Also nature. We're blessed to live in Mount Washington, which is a neighborhood in Pittsburgh. It's actually a mountain that overlooks the city of Pittsburgh. And the mountain is surrounded by woods. And it happens that activists, including my wife, had the city transform that wasteland into a beautiful park. And they wrote grants and did work the politics and work the activist scene. And now we are in the middle of a beautiful sloping park that goes down to the river on two sides. So that's another way. Also, I find peace in writing. I put aside 3 or 4 hours every morning, and I just sit in front of a blank screen until something comes, and I write it down. Lately, it's been fiction. I'm creating wonderful worlds out of the fantasy genre. But last year, it was mostly poetry that I wrote. And so writing gives me peace. Exercise. I'm a committed vegan. I've been a vegan for 12 years. So cooking and preparing food is a set of rituals which I really enjoy, and also lecturing people about why they shouldn't be eating what they're eating. That gives me a lot of joy. It makes me annoying as hell, but with me joy, so they're going to have to deal with it. But there's a lot of things I get joy from. When my children were small, I especially enjoyed their company. Those of you who've raised children know that there's nothing like being around children to make you feel joy and peace, also to drive you nuts. But that's the other side of it. What gives you peace is also what makes you nuts.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
those are the things. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you. So this question I wanted to address now is you're talking about how poetry is not therapy. So I actually have it written down. What do you believe is the role of poetry in the world today?
Well, In America, the role of poetry has shrunk to the point where it is virtually irrelevant in public life. And I've been grateful that recently it's started to come back into public life. And I think the Bidens and their choice of a poet for the inauguration, and also other things that they've done with poetry. I just, Vox Populi, the website blog that I edit, we just ran a short documentary where Joe Biden is talking with Elizabeth Alexander and others about the wonderful poem by Robert Hayden, Those Winter Mornings. And Joe Biden, bless his heart, he said that he was traumatized when he was young and had a speech impediment. He stuttered, and he taught himself to stop stuttering by reading and reciting poetry. So there's an example where therapy and poetry coincided in an important way. And to have a president who turns to poetry when he is in pain, when he's frightened, when he needs help, that's a tremendous boon, because poetry does heal. I say it's not therapy, and that's true, but the arts do heal. They create order in a disordered universe. They give us joy. They give us a form for our suffering, so we can recognize what we're going through and what other people have gone through that's similar. So there's an important role to play. I wish that poetry had a much more public place in America. And I say that not because I want more attention, although more book sales are always nice, but because I think that America needs it. The role of a Pablo Neruda in South America, or the role of a Rilke in Germany, or of Wordsworth in 19th century England, or some of the great African novelists and poets. They provide a voice for the people. And I wish we had that. Ginsberg performed that for a while, but God love him, he was nuts. I mean, we need somebody who's a little more centered, a little more focused than Alan was. Sam Hamill played that role to a certain degree, but America wasn't quite ready for Sam yet.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for those answers, those generous answers. Are you ready for another poem? Or
Sure.
something else that you have to read?
Sure. A poem of mine, or?
Yours, yes, of course yours. Yeah.
I'm a teacher. I'm not. For years, I read other people's poetry joyfully. I may be giving the impression that all poetry is about trauma, and that's just not true. Poetry can be about anything. I've been writing poems a lot about trauma the last few years, but I've also written a lot of poems about joy, about happiness, about becoming larger than yourself. I'd like to read one of those. This is not a poem about trauma, it's a poem about joy and enlightenment. It's called The Summer You Learned to Swim. And it's about one of the great accomplishments of my life, which was teaching the neighborhood kids how to swim at the pool down the street from our house. And it was great. I went there every day, and kids would line up, and I'd teach them one thing or another. I learned to swim when I was in my late 30s. So I knew what went into it. I couldn't swim when I was a kid, and I missed that because the other kids could swim. So I learned that joy late in life, and I was privileged to pass it on. This is a poem about teaching my daughter, Leah, to swim when she was just 3 years old. The summer you learned to swim. The summer you learned to swim was the summer I learned to be at peace with myself. In May, you were afraid to put your face in the water, but by August, I was standing in the pool once more when you dove in, then retreated to the wall saying, "You forgot to say sugar." So I said, "Come on, sugar, you can do it." And you pushed off and swam to me and held on, laughing. Your hair stuck to your cheeks. You hiccuped with joy and swam off again. And I dove in too, trying new things. I tried not giving advice. I tried waking early to pray. I tried not rising in anger. Watching you, I grew stronger. Your courage washed away my fear. All day I worked hard thinking of you. In the evening I walked the long hill home. You were at the top, waving your small arms, pittering down the slope to me, and I lifted you high, so high to the moon. That summer, all the world was soul and water, light glancing off peaks. You learned the turtle, the cannonball, the froggy, and the flutter, and I learned to stand and wait for you to swim to me.
Thank you so much for reading that one. It's one of my favorite joyful poems of yours. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I think it's important that as poets we celebrate joy.
Mhm.
There's a lot of important roles we play, and that's one of them. So, do you have more questions, or should I read
Well,
more?
I always have more questions, but I think we would like another poem.
Okay, sure. I love reading my poems. I'm originally from the South.
Mhm.
I grew up in Texas, as I said earlier, and one of the charming customs in the South, you may know, is the habit of waitresses to call everybody by pet names. You know, darling, sweetie, honey. Uh, you know, just a little bit of affection in the middle of the meal. And I think when Northerners are down there, it's sort of startling to be addressed in that way. It seems a little too affectionate, maybe a little too informal, but Southerners are used to it and enjoy it. Living in Pittsburgh the last 30 years, I've missed it. So this is a poem about that kind of experience. Oh, darling, I like it when women I don't know call me darling. There's something kind and generous in the tone without being sexual. The intimacy of strangers is luminous, the way we wish well for the man who lost his car keys, the woman coming in out of the rain, the girl who missed her bus, the boy who stutters. The waitress who offers more coffee calls all men at the table darling. She may be somebody's wife, somebody's mother, somebody's friend, but right now, to us, she's the intimate stranger named Dolores, which means sadness, inviting us with a smile to have dessert. You want me to alamode that for you, darling?
Wonderful. Yes. Let me see. Take care.
One of my favorite poets, and perhaps one of yours, is Cesar Vallejo, the great South American poet. And of course, his greatest poem is White Stone on a Black Stone. It's been translated many times. It's a poem that works particularly well in translation because it's all about tone and image. But it also has some strange phrases in there where he just made up words and scrambled up the grammar. And so it's challenging to translate. I've translated it, as have many other poets. But this is a poem which is based on Cesar Vallejo's great poem, but is not actually a translation. It's my version of the feeling that he gave. You may remember his poem begins, I will die in Paris on a rainy day, a day much like this one. This poem is about Pittsburgh. It's called Black Brick, Yellow Brick. I will die in Pittsburgh on a beautiful day, a day I imagine much like today. I will die in Pittsburgh. Don't turn away. It will be a Monday like today in spring. Yes, it will be Monday because this poem arrives on a Monday with its rhymes all awry, and never so much as today have I felt so alive. Michael Sims is dead. They beat him because he was guilty, and also, as you know, he was innocent. They held him in quarantine and beat him hard with questionnaires. The witnesses are the beautiful Mondays, the radiant Tuesdays, the Wednesdays that belong to someone else in another town.
It's fabulous.
So it's my little version. Sam Hamill used to do that too. You remember that he has many poems where he takes an old Chinese air, a tune, and he either writes a poem of his own to that tune, or he translates a poem that was written to that tune. So sometimes as poets, we pick up on somebody else's work and echo it and extend it. I think it's a wonderful thing to do to keep a tradition alive.
That poem, I love the poem that you just read, but it can get gut punched today because it reminded me of the day that I heard you had COVID. And I was devastated when I heard that. I didn't know how sick you were. I didn't know if I would see you again, even in the virtual realm. I was really, upset. And then as I'm reading through your book, the poem Scarf, and it says, I felt a surge of gratitude to be among such decent people in this lovely city in a dark time when the light of kindness seems so rare. Yes. And these are Michael's words. That's Michael's words. And that sums up your presence here for me, and I mean, it's not just a bridge to Sam, and the connection there. It's like you are so kind. You're such a wonderful presence for so many people on a daily basis. You're sharing our poetry, you're bringing other poets to our attention, you're doing all these wonderful things and living and moving through the world in such a beautiful way.
Well, thank you. Thank you. A near-death experience is a way of kind of reordering your priorities. I became extremely prolific in my writing after that, realizing that, any of us can drop dead any moment. And so whatever we're going to do in this life, it's really time to get started on it and devote ourselves to it and not think we're going to start in the spring or start next year. So that close call was an important experience for me. My sister-in-law just had a close call too with cancer. I won't tell you the whole story because it goes on and on. But she said a similar thing that she's an artist. She's a potter mainly, and now there's big projects she wants to do. She can't delay any further. Yeah.
Yes.
Here's a short. Go ahead.
You have a request from the audience, from
okay.
Lauren, and it's, I love your poem Hands, if you have it there.
I'll be glad to read it. I read it the other day at a Zoom meeting. In the discussion afterwards, somebody who knows my work very well said, most of Michael's poems are not as mean as that poem. So I didn't think of it as a mean poem, but I guess it is. It is a poem that's very aware of class, and that's the point of the poem, is that there's a resentment, very strong resentment among the working class against the professional class. And I grew up largely working class. My people are East Texas rednecks, Southern Baptist, and there are good reasons why I left that culture. I mean, it's a dysfunctional culture in many ways, but they did teach me some things. And one of the things they taught me was how to work really hard, how to take my work seriously, and how to be loyal to your friends and to your family. And those are important lessons. So whatever dysfunctions that society has, it also has some wonderful qualities. When I was a young man, I worked as a handyman for rich people, and also for a while as a hotel and at a hotel. And I would just go into a situation and fix whatever needed to be fixed. If it was small, if it was larger, then I'd have to call in a specialist. But that's the way I made my living, summers when I was in college. And my son, as it happens, is a carpenter. And when he was first starting his contracting business, he took on a lot of small jobs, fixing a window, replacing a window, or repairing a light switch, those kinds of small jobs. And so he was a professional handyman for a couple of years until his renovation business really got off the ground. And he and I were talking about this one time, about going into rich people's homes and the ways that they treated you, which is, not to put too fine a point on it, like shit. I mean, they assume that because you work with your hands and they work in an office, that it's their responsibility to look down on you and to distrust you. And so this is a poem called Hands, and it's about those guys, and I used to be one of them, who come into our homes and do. Sorry, I lost you for a moment there. Am I back?
Yes.
Okay, good. So those guys who come into our homes and fix things, called Hands. Every man who works with his hands has seen that look. Perhaps we showed up to patch the roof, service the furnace, or unclog the sewer, and the pasty bank manager expounds his idiotic theory of what should be done. His wife, with her $200 haircut, points her manicured finger at the wet place on the ceiling. We do the work and stand there, not knowing what to do with our hands as she makes out the check, complaining of the cost. As we explain what was involved, she looks at us as if we were just released from prison, correct in her questions, rude in her attitude. Her husband brags how he could have done the work, but doesn't have time these days, busy with clients, blah, blah, blah. They despise us because they depend on us. How long will they survive in the coming collapse of their roofs? Their pink bathrooms filling with shit, their Wedgwood china traded for scraps of food. After they've burned the last stick of furniture in the fireplace, they'll flee their useless homes, beg to join us beside the fire, greedily devour our rabbit meat, the bowl of weeds our wives gathered, admire our hairy, large-knuckled hands, and tremble as we howl with the dogs at the moon.
Wonderful.
So that's a poem about class consciousness. I was a Bernie supporter. I mean, the world has moved on since then, but I will always be a Bernie supporter. And one thing that Bernie said, which I really believe is true, is that the white working class and the black working class have a lot more in common with each other than they do with the professional and rich people classes. And he really made an effort to bring us together, and I'll always appreciate that. I think that the division of wealth in this country is a crime against humanity, that some children should be hungry while other people have billions of dollars is just unthinkable. And so that's a poem about class. And the fantasy there is that civilization collapses and those of us who know how to work with our hands are able to survive, and the people who don't know how to work with their hands can't survive. You know, their yachts are sunken or whatever. So
Robert said that was mean in a good way.
thank you, Robert. I could have used you the other night, Robert.
Yes.
But poetry sometimes is mean. I mean, sometimes mean things need to be said. I think that we live in a time when people want to be nice and poets want to be nice, and that's a wonderful thing, you know, for us to be nice to each other and not snarky. But sometimes difficult things need to be said, and that's one thing I admire about African American poets now, is that they are saying the things that need to be said. They're not feeling bound, in some cases at least, to say only nice things.
Yes.
So,
I mean, this being human, this moving through this world, we aren't nice people. I mean, many people aren't nice. So if you have warts and all, you have meanness, you have violence, you have the full spectrum. It's like the Blakey contrarities, you know,
yes,
happy, sadness, you know, good, bad, and on. I can't think of all of them right now, but yes. And I appreciate the poems that are, I don't want to say more real. They're not edited to be palatable. That might be the best way of saying it.
yes, I like that phrase. Yes. Yes, we need to say what we need to say and not be held back by convention of wanting to be liked,
Yes.
especially to be liked by the powerful.
Yes. We have a comment by Christine. It's a longer one, and then let's have another poem. This reminds me of the time when I delivered wedding photos to a gal with manicured nails and a $200 haircut. She ran a boutique at a mall, but was only as a sideline because her husband was an executive director of the University of Iowa Foundation. She complained about the price of the photos and went on in front of customers. I picked up a teeny bar of soap she had on display near the cash register and said, of course, this $5 bar of soap isn't marked up either.
Yes, it does sound like a similar experience. I think any of us who have had jobs which are not in quote management have the feeling of being looked down on, of being treated as if we're less than. And
Yes.
that's really too bad, because there's so many people who do necessary work that we should be celebrating. I personally think one of the most important jobs in this country is daycare. The people who we trust our children and grandchildren to, why should they be paid minimum wage and treated as if they're lowly servants when we're trusting them with the most valuable thing we have, which is the safety of our children?
Yes.
So I think there are lots of people who are doing absolutely essential work who don't get the credit they deserve. And COVID, of course, has been horrible in many ways, but one of the good things that come out of it is that we've come to realize that some jobs are essential. I mean, we have garbage pickup where I live. It doesn't cost anything. It comes out of our tax money. If people were not willing to do that work, we would very quickly be buried under all of the plastic and other garbage that we create. So I think we should celebrate our essential workers in our poetry.
Yes. Yeah. So how about one more poem, and then we can, it's okay if it goes a little bit past because we have our after party for a little bit here. I'm letting somebody in. So it can go past 6 o'clock by a bit, and then we'll have an announcement and open it up so everybody can say hello if they'd like to.
All right. I'll read a poem called Tree of Life. This poem has been published and republished a number of times, I think because it describes something which is important to all of us. You may be familiar that in Pittsburgh, there is a synagogue called Tree of Life. And it happens that a few years ago, on a Saturday morning during services, a white nationalist burst in the doors and shot a number of people. He killed 11 people and wounded many others. One of my friends and her mother was in there. Her mother was killed by shooting, and my friend was wounded in the arm, and she's a dental hygienist and could no longer work. So ever since then, she's been on disability. This is a terrible, terrible thing. These people were not doing anything other than celebrating community and praying to their God. So this is a poem that I wrote shortly after, a few weeks after the experience, and it's dedicated to Arlene Weiner and Philip Terman, two friends of mine, one of whom was a member of that congregation, and the other one, Philip Terman, is Jewish but a member of a different congregation, and he and I talked about this incident afterwards. Tree of Life. When the young man wearing a yarmulke asks, "Excuse me, sir, are you Jewish?" I want to say, "Yes, I've studied history and know something about suffering," but that's not what he means. He's trying to find 10 men for a minyan at Rodef Shalom down the street. And when the young man carrying a Bible asks, "Have you heard the good news?" I want to say, "Yes, the cherry trees are blossoming." And when he asks, "Have you been saved?" I want to say, "Yes, I've been saved by poetry from a childhood of abuse and humiliation." That's a kind of miracle, isn't it? But I know he wants to know whether I've accepted Jesus into my heart, and there's the rub, because my heart is so small and Jesus is so big. When I walk into a cathedral, my heart sings. When I walk into a forest, the trees sing. And when I walk down the street, the legless man on the sidewalk puts his whole heart into the ukulele. Oh, Susanna, we are saved. It is springtime in Pittsburgh and in America. My friend Rashid is an atheist because his mother was killed by a bomb. His father died unhappy and his sister has moved to Australia. Rashid blames all his tragedies on religion, and he may be right. We all have our tragedies, and maybe God is to blame. What do I know? Well, I know this much. Anyone who has grown a garden, raised a child, or looked at the sky far from a city knows the truth. So, yes, I'm a believer in the big dark, the unknown, the sense that my little mind is part of the big mind I'll never know. But I have to say, God, like a lazy cop, never seems to be around when you need him. Somewhere a soldier is beating a boy for throwing stones. Somewhere a priest is raping a child. Somewhere a girl in a marketplace has a bomb strapped to her chest. My friend and her mother were in the Tree of Life synagogue when a man who hated immigrants pushed through the door of their faith with an automatic rifle. You know the rest.
Such a beautiful poem.
Thank you. That's, again, a poem about trauma. It's the trauma that is caused, that has as its root bigotry, anti-Semitism in this case. But every day in America, someone is being killed for nothing more than their ethnicity. And that's a trauma we all carry. So trauma lives with us in many different forms, including as racism, anti-Semitism, violence. So that's why I've been writing about it the last couple of years.
This has been a wonderful conversation, an hour. I'm going to open it up so everybody can say hello in just a minute. I just thank you for your words and thank you for having me move through the world. Thank you for being willing to spend time with us tonight. It's been wonderful. There's a lot of great comments and I'll save a copy of them. We are going to have an announcement really quick, and then I will open it up so everybody can say hello. And I'm going to unmute you, Robert.
Okay. Okay. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Writing for Peace publishes an anthology of writing twice a year called Dovetails. The theme this year is Letters from the Self to the World. The guest editor is Adriana Paramo. The deadline is April 1st. Definitely want Michael to submit something, please, please. And anybody else, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to copy and paste in the information right now.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, I will certainly submit. I was thinking about submitting, but I have such high regard for writing for peace, I was a little hesitant about doing it. So thank you for the invitation.
Oh, please submit something. I'm going to unmute everybody. Are you going to post the link in the chat or just refer them to the website? Don't want to cause trouble for you. I wasn't sure. There we go. It just showed up. Thank you. Oh, no, let's see. There we go. Yep.
Okay.
All the information is there. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to give you the chance, and this is going to give you the chance to unmute yourself. So you still have to click it to unmute yourself. But now you should be able to do that. Anybody want to say hello?
Thank you, Michael, for those incredibly courageous poems that we need more than anything else. I mean, writing like you do invites other people to write like you do. And that's what's important. We're all brothers and sisters here. and for me, people like you who not only write and give us permission to write like you, but also support poems of honesty and emotional courage. I'm so grateful for that, and so grateful for you. And I wish I could buy one of those big things on the highway and said, "Read Michael Sims, support Michael Sims." But I haven't won the lotto yet.
That's great. I haven't thought about billboards advertising poetry, but I really like that idea. Thank you, Fran.
When my wife and I moved to Pittsburgh in 1987, as we pulled into the freeway, there was a billboard. It was advertisement for the International Poetry Forum, which no longer exists. They ran out of money years ago. But when we pulled into Pittsburgh, I knew that I had come home to see a short poem on a billboard that just made me feel very welcome here. So billboards, I think, are places for poems. There was a national movement. Some of you may remember, for a while there were poetry on the buses.
Yes, and on subways.
On subways. A wonderful poem. My friend Sandra Cisneros, she and I go way back. We were students together a long time ago.
We're having trouble hearing you, Michael.
Yeah,
Sorry.
could you speak closer to your?
Cisneros' poems was one of Cisneros' first poems was a poem on a bus.
Oh, really?
Oh, wonderful.
Many years ago, I worked with Francis Balter on the Poetry on the Buses project.
Oh,
It was
wonderful.
probably in the early 1970s or so.
In what city?
In Pittsburgh.
In Pittsburgh. Oh, wonderful. Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. Anybody else want to unmute and say hello? Anybody who hasn't shown your face? Care to show your face? Hi, Carolyn.
Hello, hello. I'm glad you sent me that little note, Juniper, because I might have lost track. This is the third Zoom reading today, fourth Zoom meeting. Anyway, it's been quite a day. But this is my first exposure to your work, Michael. I'm really impressed, and you write very directly and very clearly, and I really appreciate that, given all the issues that we're all dealing with these days, and poetry that speaks clearly is very important. And I wanted to ask you, not anything about your work at the moment, but you must know Jim Daniels,
Yes.
who's at Carnegie Mellon. He's another working class poet, and I hope he's an ally for you. I mean, he's a good. Pardon?
Jim Daniels and I have been friends for a long time.
Good. Yeah, he's a great guy.
Yeah, I was poet in residence at Carnegie Mellon years ago for one semester, and he and I got to know each other there. I like him and admire him. He's a prolific writer. He comes out with a new every 6 months or so. He's just really novels and film scripts and short stories. He's quite extraordinary. But the way we got to know each other best, Jim and I, is that he was my daughter's soccer coach.
Ah, okay.
It was nice to know another poet and hardly ever talk about poetry. Instead, we talk about kids and our families, and he's quite athletic, so he was an excellent.
That's great. Yeah. He's a poet I admire. And he also has done poems that respond to other poems, as you did with your response to Black Stone Upon a White Stone, which is a wonderful technique. That technique has a number of names, but it's really, have you written other poems in that way, in responding to other poems?
Yes, I have. I have a whole series of poems which respond to Vallejo's poem,
Ah, okay.
and it talks about one of them is about the death of my sister. Another was George Floyd. Another about Martin Luther King.
Mhm.
So I have a whole series of those. So I hope they'll go into my new book, but my editor gets to have a say on that. So see.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciated this. It was wonderful.
Thank you for coming. Yes. Anybody else want to say hello?
Michael, are there any lines that haunt you? You know how we have lines that just stay with us and stay with us for years and years? Do you have any lines that you'd love to quote?
I I recite a number of poems, especially by James Wright, and you may know his poem, which has rather vulgar title, but is truly beautiful poem. It's called "On Hearing That the Oldest Whorehouse in Wheeling, West Virginia, has been
Yes.
condemned," and it begins, "I will grieve alone." And it's
Mm,
been a while since I've recited that poem, so I'm not going to try it cold right now. But
right. But that line, I will grieve alone.
I will grieve alone with it, and it has ironic dialogue between the first line and the title of the poem. He's grieving the closing of a whorehouse, uh, but as we find out, it's because as a small boy he stood across the river and watched the girls, the prostitutes, come down to the river, and as you remember in the poem, they turn into swans, and then they
Yes.
commit suicide. And the poem ends with the wonderful lines. uh, For nobody commits suicide only to find on the other side of the river, Wheeling, West Virginia. So, uh, so it opens up the poem so that it becomes a humorous,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
about grief, about a small child experiencing sorrow and grief. So, yes, there are poems, there are whole poems, and there are also individual lines that do haunt me. How about you, Laurent? What are some of the
I have so many individual lines that haunt me. I mean, one of them is Bridget Pegeen Kelly's line, "This song is sweet, it is sweet, the heart dies of this sweetness." And every time I hear something beautiful, immediately it comes in my mind, oh, this is sweet, it is sweet, the heart dies of this sweetness. I'm madly in love with the poetry of Bridget Pegeen Kelly. As I am, I was thinking of you because you were praising Pittsburgh, and I was thinking of that last line of Jerry Stern saying, "Beautiful, filthy Pittsburgh," you know. What is it? The town of the evil melons. Um, there's so many lines that just come back because of life happening, you know.
oh,
And
Jerry, go ahead.
I was wondering which ones would come back to you like that.
In that same poem, Jerry Stern says, "How I love the 40 bridges of Pittsburgh and how I
Yes.
hate the fricks."
Yes.
And the
Yes.
poems
I
ends,
mean, yeah.
"Lucky life, lucky, lucky life."
Lucky life. Yeah. Yeah.
And
I
something
forgot about that poem.
the music of that line has stayed with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Phil Levine and Jerry Stern, and those are working class poets that are like you, that resonate with the daily working class haunts, you know, the haunting things of the working class.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, Phil
and
Levine
I'm,
is one of my poets. Yeah,
yeah,
Philip Levine is one of my favorite poets.
I'm sure. I'm sure. I mean, that makes absolute. Not knowing that of you, I would have sworn that. You know, I would have said, "Oh, Phil Levine and Sims Day."
Do you know if he was an artist? Did he draw also, Levine? I have
His wife, Fran Levine, was a painter. painted
This
a
is
lot.
actually a line drawing. It's a nude of a woman that I inherited from Sam, and it's signed Levine. And it's hard to read, but I'm pretty sure it probably is.
It's probably Fran Levine.
It looks like a P, not an F. So,
Oh, well then he
yeah.
drew it probably. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know.
so
That
that
I don't
could be
know.
another Levine, but I was just, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, keep
Didn't wanna
that.
get
That's
too
precious.
far frolicking detour, but anybody else want to say hello? Phil, want to say hello? It's lovely to see you.
I really enjoyed listening to your poetry, and I was wondering how you would kind of characterize the music of working class poetry, because you seem to value the music of poetry. And if you had to kind of sum it up, what would you say the music of working class poetry like Phil Levine or Gerald Stern is?
I don't
What a
think
good.
I don't think there's one kind of music. I think that the best poets base their rhythms and their diction in the language that they grew up with. So that the poetry of, say, Gwendolyn Brooks has a different kind of rhythm, different sound to it than, say, Phil Levine or Sandra Cisneros, who is, as you know, Latinx. So I think that the rhythms vary depending on what their native dialect is. And one of my favorite poets, who's not read much anymore, is Alan. Sorry, I'm getting old. I lose names. And he said that he was from Brooklyn. He said he did not write in English. He wrote in Brooklynese. And
Yeah.
I think that's true, that we write our native dialects. At least the best writers do, I think.
But aren't some dialects conspicuously working class in American society?
What are you thinking of?
Well, I'm thinking of Levine, and I'm thinking of. I'm also thinking that Gwendolyn Brooks is not a working class poet, and that we can make a distinction between Levine and Gwendolyn Brooks as poets on the basis of one being a more musical in a traditional way than Levine.
I see.
Mhm.
I see the distinction you're making. Yes. So it's not so much about what their roots are, it's about what kind of diction and rhythms they use.
Yeah, and I'm asking, are there dictions and rhythms that
Yes.
we associate with working class America?
Ha, such a good question.
Very good question. I don't offhand know the answer to it, but I think that Jerry Stern does write in a Pittsburgh dialect. I think that Phil Levine does write in a Detroit dialect.
Yeah, yeah.
W.S. Merwin, I think he was heavily influenced by French and Spanish poetry. So he's not really writing out of an American dialect necessarily.
Do you think that
How
someone like Delmore Schwartz was writing in a working class dialect?
Delmore Schwartz, yeah.
I'm not sure. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to cross Yiddish with a kind of high flying American English.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I'm going to have to think about it before I
Yeah,
try.
me too. I love that question, Phil. Really. Thank you. I'm going to start think. Linda
Mhm.
Hull sometimes has that. Do you know the poems of Linda Hull?
She's so
It's been a while
nice.
since I read her, but yes. Mhm.
She has a working class woman's dialect. I mean, not dialect, but it's a way of speaking. You know, it's the syntax. I think it has to do with very curt and immediate syntax. Not, don't you think, Phil?
Yeah, I think immediacy has a lot to do with it.
Yeah. And
Um,
that the
and,
syntax then creates that music.
Carolyn, is it Carolyn or Caroline?
It's Carolyn. The E is silent, but it's there.
Okay. She had said directness, and that's what I was thinking too. So there's a more directness, the brusqueness. Like if you think of like a New Yorkers, on the street, they're going to be brusque and intense. No offense, Stan. I saw you join us, New York.
And it's kind of face to face. It's intended, it's kind of spoken, it's oral.
It is, isn't it?
Mhm.
And that's what Phil Levine does when he always at a certain moment, he addresses the reader. He says, what do you think? Or have you ever seen? Or not like you. And there's that immediate contact with the reader. Do you agree, Phil?
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. No, I agree.
One of my favorite poets is Robert Gibb, and
Oh,
he's
Yes.
Monongahela River outside Pittsburgh, and he's written brilliantly about poems about the working class there, the steel workers and their families, the generation of workers there. And I recently wrote an essay about his poem Kites, which I published years ago in one of his books. And the first line of that poem is, "Come March, we'd see them in the five and dimes." You listen to that line, "Come March." It's not in springtime, it's not early in the year, it's not in April, it's come March. And that's the way we speak in this dialect, in this region. So he created a rhythmic device that uses the local dialect, and it's very musical. That first line, "Come March, we'd see them in the five and dime." That line has a lot of nasal sounds. Come March, we'd see them in the five and dime. So there's half rhymes and assonance throughout that poem, and yet it's in a regional dialect. So that to me is the ideal poet, one who can capture the dialect of his upbringing, of his native region, and yet do it in a musical way. Robert Frost did that too with his capturing the New England dialect, and like Robert Gibb, Frost used ancient metrics, sapphics, alcaics, iambic pentameter, other ancient forms, and melded them with his own native dialect to create a music out of his native language. We don't usually think of the Mon Valley as a beautiful dialect. I mean, it's like one of my friends is from someplace else, described it as, it's easy to speak that dialect. You just put a sock in your mouth and start talking, because like talk on a side of our mouth, and we slur a lot of words, and it's like that. But Robert Gibb has successfully taken that working class dialect and turned it into music. And that is a great poet. Phil Levine does that with the Detroit accent, Jerry Stern with the Pittsburgh dialect, but his is the East End Pittsburgh dialect, not the Mon Valley, slightly different than Gibbs. And you look at the great playwrights and prose writers too. August Wilson wrote beautiful plays, poetic plays. They're not lined like poetry, but they do have the music of poetry. And he's using the dialect, the African-American dialect of his youth. And it's recognizable. It's different than the dialect that I'm speaking now, or the white people in this region speak. It's a different dialect. And he took that despised way of speaking and turned it into music. So that's what great poets can do. And I think August Wilson was a great poet, even though he worked in dramatic form instead of in lined verse. And you see that with other authors too. William Shakespeare, of course, took his dialect, this country bumpkin dialect of Stratford-on-Avon, and took it into London, turned it into music. Londoners just ate it up. It comes down to us as beautiful poetry. But he was taking an ugly regional dialect, something that was despised by Londoners, and turning it into pure music. And there were other authors like Ben Jonson of his generation who wrote in the London dialect. But Shakespeare chose his native dialect. So this is what poets do. They take ordinary language and they turn it into music.
Thomas Hardy did that brilliantly in the British.
Oh, yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And he was scorned for it, just like what you said is why so many fools want to prove that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. He couldn't possibly have written he couldn't have known all that about people.
Stan and Michael, have you two met before?
I was listening on my cell phone. I don't know if you saw my presence on it though.
No, but
I wasn't taking attendance. I just wanted to make sure to make the connection. That
Hi, Michael. I like this conversation. It's one of the smartest conversations I've been in quite a while.
well, thanks, Stan.
Things that
Hi,
matter to
Stan.
poets.
Hi,
I missed
Stan.
your reading, evidently. However, I'm sorry to say.
That's okay.
No,
I'll start sending you regular, like a couple of reminders.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just-
reminders help. Reminders are very helpful. There's so many Zoom events, it's easy to lose track.
I was on another one that was supposed to end it earlier with some scientists I adore.
Mm.
Sorry.
No, I just wanted to make sure that you two met. I've been wanting to introduce you to. So
Yeah, that's great. I really liked, I was listening to this on my phone for a few minutes. It's such a smart conversation you always want to have with poets. You want to sit around and talk about these things that don't matter to the world, that matter to poets. I would throw in Jack Gilbert as somebody who isn't especially regional, but is absolutely plain spoken in a cunning way. He just invites you right in. It's if he doesn't care about audience, but he invites you right in to where he is. You know, God and I were sitting out front. You know what I mean? He just invites you right in.
Yeah, I love his work.
Yeah, I do too.
yeah. Hey, anybody else want to say hello that hasn't already said hello before we call it quits here? I'm not the one that edits these down, so we'll have to end it soon. I'll have to apologize for Craig for going on too long.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for being here, for listening to my poems. Thank you for your comments and your questions. Some of you I've been friends with for years. Others I'm new to here, meeting you here. But I really appreciate all of you being here. Thank you.
Catherine's asking, this event is every Sunday night. So before you took off, I wanted you to hear that, Catherine. Every Sunday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. I think that the only day that I am going to cancel is Mother's Day, but we're going for every Sunday other than that. And you can find us on the Writing for Peace website, or you can find us through the Facebook page. My dog is being persistent here, so I'm sorry, I'm kind of talking. I'm just so grateful, Michael, for all, like I said earlier, how you move through the world, all the advocacy you do for all of us. I'm sure you've published many of us that are hanging out here or we're here tonight. And you're just a lovely human. And hopefully I get to meet your lovely wife sometime. So
You like her. You really like her.
I'm sure I will. Please tell her hello. Yeah.
I will.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
for coming. Yeah.
Great to meet you, Michael. Thanks for your work, and good to see you again, Juniper. And Stan, and Laura-Ann, and Phil, and everybody else I've seen at other events, and even in real time, in real place in the past, in the old times. Okay, thanks so much. It was wonderful.
Oh, we couldn't hear you, Stan.
These people I was on Zoom with and forgetting this one said, we have to go because we have dinner reservations at a restaurant. I said, what? That's an old fashioned, what kind of dialect are you speaking?
Soon we'll be drinking wine on the water in Port Townsend together. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Oh,
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Good to see you, Phil.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Okay.
I